Well, hello and welcome to the editing room. I'm AJ O'Neill, your Beyond Code instructor. What you're about to watch is extracted from a live mentorship session on loops, part of a playlist, which you can find in the description. This particular segment is on transforming data from an array, particularly using things like map and Pluck. Although we're using JavaScript here, these concepts apply to many modern languages, including dynamic and compiled languages such as Go and Rust. And here we go. So do you have anything else that you are wanting to understand better about what the loop is doing?
The only thing I want to see is its application to manipulating more information, I guess.
All right. Can you give me an example to go from?
Maybe there's an array of names that you're having a spreadsheet and you're trying to loop through and edit them or something like that.
Okay.
You're trying to add something onto the names that you want to do for each name rather than doing it individually.
We're going to make you 22.
You're very generous.
I try to be. Okay. So a spreadsheet is what we would call a two-dimensional array or an array of arrays. So we could represent this, you can consider this to be every column of the spreadsheet. So we have first name, last name, age, favorite color. Typical spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want to go through this loop, and in most modern languages, there are, I forget what the correct term is, but we have other types of loop functions that we typically use, things like map or reduce. Although personally, I don't use reduce a whole lot. I use filter a ton. I use map a ton. In the cases where I would use reduce, I often just do it the more old-fashioned way rather than a reduce. Are you familiar with map or filter?
Not really. I've had them run by me, but
Okay.
I don't know exactly how they function.
Well, let's say that we're going to implement a map manually with this data here. So we'll call this new CSV. And actually it won't even be CSV. We'll call it a bag. Why not? So we're gonna grab some things from the CSV, and we're gonna put it in this bag of objects. And that could be an array. We could actually make it an object of objects. That would be fine too. In fact, no, I'm gonna leave it with this for now. Keep it like that. Let's go back. We have our CSV. We're going to transform the CSV. We're going to do a map operation, and in particular, we're going to do a type of map operation that is called Pluck. So we will just take the very first element of I'm going to call this a row, because that is both CSV and database terminology. What I need to do here is actually first, we need to define the length that we're going for. So we're going to do csv.length. So I is equal to 0, while I is less than csv.length, which is going to be equal to 2. So I is going to go from 0 to 1 to 2, and then when it reaches 2, it will no longer continue. And then we're saying, what should I do? I should increment by 1 every turn. Now, there are occasions where you might want to increment by 2. There are cases where things come paired together, and so you might reference the current item and the item ahead of it, and you might skip by 2. I've done that before. And that's where for loops come in really, really handy, is they're very versatile in that you can do unusual things with them, whereas we don't really typically need to use this type of a for loop for what we're doing. We're just doing it for illustrative purposes because we're doing this the manual way. So I'm going to take a row, and my row is CSVI. I is changing every iteration of the loop. It's starting at 0. So in the very first iteration of the loop, I'm going to be grabbing this array as the value. So this array is now the row, And if I want to grab just the first name, then I would do var first equals row, and then I would put in here 0, because no matter which row I'm on, the 0th item of that row is the first name.
Right. Yeah, this is the part where I get confused. Is like, for example, var row equals CSV, and then in brackets you have the I.
Yeah.
So that is representing just one of the items in the array.
Yes. So if we were to do this by hand real quick, let me go back up here. This would be equivalent to CSV sub 0. So we call this an index, or why is it called sub? I can't remember what sub is short for. But there's a reason. It's short for something. I just don't remember what it is. But we would call this sub 0 or sub 1 or sub 2 or index 0, index 1, index 2. In this case, there is no index 2 because we only have 2 items in this array. But that's what the I is taking the placeholder value of. Every iteration of the array, I is a different value.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
So in the first iteration of the array, row is only the first item, and in the next iteration, it is only the second item. And of course, first and second, I mean 0th and firth. And then here, row is representative of a different row each time. And the 0th field, actually, I could call this field. We could have called this fields, actually. It would be appropriate to call that row or fields. Either of those names would be a correct name. Since fields is plural, I'm actually going to go back and say that we're going to use the term fields, because row is singular, and that doesn't communicate that it is something that holds multiple values, even though row technically is plural, because row means multiple fields. It means 0 or more fields. But let's call it fields because that's more explicit. So we're grabbing fields sub 0, and that would be AJ when the fields that we have are the 0th row or 0th set of fields, and it would be Brent in the next iteration when it is the first 0th first. I hate 0 indexing. It's so confusing to explain 0th and first and second.
You're not a fan of JavaScript?
No, it's not. So JavaScript is a language where it really doesn't make sense to have zero-based indexing, because zero-based indexing does not apply to JavaScript as a language. I'll go on a tangent about that in a minute, but let's wrap up with this, and then I will explain why we start at 0. There's a very simple explanation for it, but I'll save that for just a minute. So now what we want to do is our pluck operation. So we'll do bag.push first. And so effectively what we've done here is we've gone through every set of fields or every row. We've picked the first field in that set of fields or row, meaning the 0th. And then we are putting that first name, in this case, I called this first as in first name, not first as in first field. And we push that onto our bag. And then at the end, if we look at our bag, we will have only the first names in our bag. So we will have taken our CSV and we'll have shortened it down to just the names. And that is a proper pluck.
I haven't heard the term pluck before.
You will. Plucking is this, when we have a bunch of things and we want, just think of it like plucking a feather. Mm-hmm. We want to specifically pluck this feather out of every chicken. It's plucking. Now, if I were to write this in a more modern way, because this is very much the ancient C-style way of writing a pluck operation, which is very good for illustrating the loop. But if we were to write this in the more modern way, we don't need any of this initialization business, because the most common reason to have a loop is to iterate over every item one by one. And so really the whole idea that we're going to specify that we're starting at 0 and that we're counting until the end is kind of a nuisance. It's not really productive. If you were counting by 2 or counting by an arbitrary unit, that kind of makes sense. But what we have instead is map. And map is a specific type of loop that it knows. So there's for each and map are fairly similar. But map returns a new array afterwards. Most of the functions that are looping functions return a new array. Filter returns probably a smaller array because you might be filtering by, say, names that start with the letter A, and so you get back only an array of names that start with the letter A. In the case of map, we're changing. It's called map because we're transforming what it looks like. We're starting with an array of arrays that has 4 fields in it, and we're ending up with a single array of strings. So I'll go ahead and run this so you can see exactly what I mean by what the result is. Whoops. Let me get rid of that here. I can get rid of that line because we do not need that line anymore. So let me just run this so you see what the output is. It's the same as what it was before. It is a single array of strings. And then the way that this works, it's very much like our loop before, except that we know that what we want to deal with is each element of the loop. So sometimes people will put a less descriptive name here, like L as an element or item. In this case, I'm saying fields because it's a little bit more descriptive because we're working with a hypothetical CSV. But do you see how this map function is doing what a loop does, but just eliminating some of the clutter?
Not really. I'm not seeing that.
Okay.
It's just a foreign concept to me.
Okay. Well, before, let's take a little bit of a step back here. So we had our block. We talked about our block, right?
Right.
And we were looping over the block.
Uh-huh.
In this case, we have a function rather than a block. The function has a block inside of it, as you can see here, but we're looping over a function, and a function can receive values. And so this function is receiving the field's value. So whereas just like what we did at the very beginning where I showed you, here are the 3 different steps that a loop is doing, now we can put them in order. What we did is we eliminated those 3 steps, and we eliminated one additional step, which was to, because what are we doing in every single loop? We just want the next thing, right? So I was starting at 0. It was going to 1. It would have gone to 2 and 3 and 4 until whatever number of items is exhausted. And then we were creating a variable to store that iteration. When we use the map function, we give it a function that receives that value already given to us, so we don't have to do an assignment. So every single time this function is called, it's receiving the next item or element in the array that it is mapping over. So we have a CSV. We're mapping over each item or element of that hypothetical CSV array. And the function is receiving that without us having to explicitly say, okay, what's the number that you're at? Okay, you're at number 0. What row is at number 0? This row is at number 0. Okay, what's the next number you're at? You're at number 1. What row is this? It's just calling that function on the next item automatically because that's the thing that makes sense to do. That's what we want to do. We wouldn't want to, I mean, there are cases where you would, but typically if we had 100 rows, we don't want to go over rows 6, 7, 12, and 13. We want to go over every row.
That makes more sense. Yeah.
So this fields, let me just go ahead and console.log this out so that it is more readily apparent. See? It's the same thing that we had before. It's taking each one of them one by one. But we don't have to create it and assign it ourselves. And if we wanted to reduce this a little bit further, I do like having variables because I feel that it's descriptive and easy to read. But you would more often, people will write very, very, I don't know what the word would be, perhaps terse. I like to write descriptive code. You will find people that write code that looks like, oh gosh, they won't even do that. They'll write code that looks like this. They'll get rid of the block. They'll get rid of the function. They'll get rid of the return. This is something that you will commonly see in the wild. People will write code that looks like this. And to me, this is not as descriptive, but it is exactly the same thing that I just showed you. There's no functional difference between the two from a technical perspective. I just prefer the other way because it's more clear. This is a function. This is the reason that we're grabbing this is because it's a first name, and we are returning this first name so that it will become part of something else, as opposed to this type of syntax where you have to really be familiar with that type of syntax to understand what it is intended to mean. At least that's my opinion. My very strong opinion.
Based on experience, of course.
Well, it's easier for me to read English than it is to read symbols. So.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. That's why coding and programming is so abstract to me, because there's so many symbols that are used.
Yeah. So I think, so for me, the equal sign makes sense. That makes sense. I'm assigning something, because we could say assign. And in fact, there are languages where they don't have symbols at all. If you want to know the terror of a language that doesn't have symbols, take a look at AppleScript. It's very easy to read. Anyone can read AppleScript, but no one can write it. Anyway, so any other questions about this process? What is still left unclear about what we've done here?
If I could tell you, if I knew how to describe it, I would tell you.
Okay, let's do the opposite. What is clear?
Are you talking about just for loops or loops in general? Or what are you referring to?
Let's step through. I'm talking about the for loop and the map in particular. Those are the two, I think, most important things. And then also blocks. I think that is very important to understand what a block is, so that you notice when it's there and when it's not there, because like I just showed you, if we omit the function block, whoops, can I go back to that? No, I can't go back to that from where I am. But we can omit the function block entirely, and this is still valid code, which is kind of, to me, that's insane, but that is the way that it is.
I understand blocks. I understand for loops. It's just the map that throws me.
Okay. So what do you understand about the map so far? Let's start with what you do understand.
I understand that it's mapping through something, in this case arrays, and that's about it, I guess.
Okay. So it's doing two things. One, let's say that we had for each here. For each would be very similar to map, except for the return wouldn't do anything. So let me present it this way. Maybe this would be a more elementary step. So if we have a for each, the only thing that a for each does is call a function that receives the next element of an array. So if we did this with a for each and we wanted to accomplish the same thing that we just accomplished, this is what we would do. We would say for each set of fields in the CSV is what we're operating on. For each set of fields in the CSV, take the first name out of the set of fields and then push it onto the bag array. So we could call this names. That would be more descriptive now that we know that we're dealing specifically with names, which I guess we've known that for a while, but I started it before that was more crystalline. So is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. So now what a map does is a map says, I know that what you want back is a new array. So we created a new array right here. We've got an array called names. We created a new array at the beginning, and we initialized it there. And then we added, on each iteration of the loop, we added to the array. A map knows that what you want to do is to create a new array. So a map returns a new array based on the array that you started with. So we start with the CSV array, and the map is going to return a new array. And the way it knows what to return is whatever we return from the function is going to be what it puts into the array that it is building. So just like we had the initialization, we kind of collapse that away when we use for each. In the map, we collapse away the defining of the new array because the purpose of a map is to return a new array.
Is that the case always, or is it just in this case because we're dealing with an array?
Well, you can only map over an array.
Okay.
And you can only get back an array from a map. So a map, okay. With a map, you start with one array that is of, say, a length of, in this case, 2, and you will always end up with an array that is of length 2. So whatever the number of inputs is the number of outputs. Map, think of it like looking up something in a dictionary is kind of what this is. So if I was given in the term welcome, I might return the definition of welcome. And so maybe I would have one array that is all terms that need to be defined. And then my result array, through some interaction, would be the list of definitions. And so I would have two arrays that were related to each other. Or I could say that I want to find all of the words, well, not find all the words. I want to reverse all of the words in an array. So everything that is spelled forwards, I want to spell it backwards. And I could have two arrays. They would be the same length. They would have the same, there would be a relationship between the data, but the map is some sort of operation that transforms from the data being in one format to being in another format. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that is what a map is. So of what we've done so far, what are the key phrases or examples that have given you aha moments, if you can articulate a few of them?
Just understanding, well, with map in particular, understanding what it applies to. It only applies to arrays. That has made it more clear because in my learning, when they introduced map, it was so abstract to me. I had no idea what it was applying to, what it meant. And so that was really good.
That's the end. Thanks for watching. If this helped you at all, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you want more like this, you can click subscribe and ring the bell. I also do daily live streams on my live stream channel in the description, and the edited videos get posted on Beyond Code Bootcamp, link also in the description. Adios.